MOZA have just released their second flight sim product, the MTP Throttle panel, featuring a truncated FA-18C Hornet design, backlight, and rumble feedback features. As always, full disclosure, I was sent the unit for free for the purposes of review. So let's talk the build quality. The base is plastic. It's a composite material, as they call it, but it feels plastic to me. There's a nice vanity metal plate, probably aluminium. It's generally pretty sturdy. I haven't found any kind of flex or concern. The handles are aluminium, and the bases down here again are that kind of composite plastic stuff. Now, there's no play in the handles themselves. They're nice and solid. They stay put. But the kind of biggest flaw of the base in general is it's a little unstable. So if I run it forward, I sometimes tip it forwards on the base, and you can also tip it to the right very easily. That's the biggest flaw. It's a bit unstable. Now that's because the handles are on the right, and of course on the base we've got pads that stop too soon, so they don't actually reach the edge, and that would really have helped because that gives a point to tip here. Now it also has mounting holes on the bottom. These are unique to the base. They're not common with, say, Thrustmaster or Windwing's mounting points, so it needs a bespoke mount. Now of course that would resolve the problem, but for tabletop use without a mount you're going to have to worry about tipping. On the front we have two more mounting points, and we have the transit and the USB. Now USB is a standard USB connector for plugging it into your computer, and the transit you'll plug in to your other MOZA device. So in this case this will be the AB9 force feedback joystick base, and that would allow you to chain it on to the unit without having to use the USB for both power and for the signal. It all works as one unit with one USB socket. The base has got USB backlighting, which if we plug it in, it lights up nicely in sequence in response. There's a little kind of flourish there, which is quite a nice little touch. Now for the switches themselves, we have a kind of truncated Hornet cockpit. We've got a number of startup switches like the generators, the battery, the INS configuration, sensor setup, and down the bottom we've got the rudder trim and takeoff trim position and the FCS reset. We also have the APU and engine crank. Now between those you can do a good portion of your startup, which means you can functionally be setting up these switches by hand without looking, while you're working around the cockpit with your right hand using the mouse, for things like your MFDs and cockpit HUD. Now of these switches, only one of them is actually keyed, and that's the laser target designator rangefinder switch, which has a little cap to it. The rest are all the same generic top. They've all got a nice good solid throw to them. They're not too soft, they're not too heavy. The probe switch does have a guard around it, so you can by touch identify it, although the APU is missing its hat, and the same for the strobe brightness. Each and every switch also has neutral positions on those that are applicable, just for ease of controls binding. On the bottom middle we have the interwing inhibit switch for the fuel flow. This is useful if you take a hit to the wings and start bleeding out fuel, but I'd probably have preferred a fuel dump switch here, but again you could just bind it as that if you really wanted. You've also got the lighting panel. Now on the lights we have a rotary encoder rather than a potentiometer or limited throw axis here, so this can turn an infinite number of times. Now that means you can repurpose the switch for whatever you fancy, but it also means you don't know when you've reached 100% brightness. So you might find yourself spinning the knob not quite knowing what percentage lights you've got unless you go look out the window or at the switch in your cockpit. So not quite ideal, but at the same time it's not the end of the world. All of these hats do have a little bit of a wobble on the control, but it's not too bad. I'd prefer it to be a little tighter, but never mind. Now the INS, this is semi-useful to have. Like I said, you could use it in the startup, but I don't like having it for the simple reason that I might grab this by accident when I'm looking for the radar perhaps, and then I'm going to junk my navigation and I can't find my way home without some other radio assistance or doing another alignment. So that's a hazardous button to have on this side of the cockpit, because you've also got the other switches, and you might well want to turn your radar, for example, into standby, although there are better ways of doing that in the Hornet. On the rear right we have this little min-max slider. Now this is not the greatest feeling material. It feels a little tiny bit rough on the edges. It's also hollow. Doesn't have very much weight to it. It does have a very solid controlled axis. There's no issues here with precision. It does not have a center detent, which is a bit of a shame, but it's also quite short and out the way. Now, most people use this as your zoom axis, and because of that, it's always good to have it within reach of the throttle when your hand is resting on it, which unfortunately it is not. It's quite a long way back there. You could reach one here, but down here it's not going to happen. So that's a little bit of a disappointment. It's okay. I would have preferred a longer arm on the unit, but it's what it is. Moving on to the front side, we also have a light control, which is functionally another rotary encoder. This one's a little more solid than the others feeling, and I assume they intend you to bind that to your panel lighting. Now, the lights should be able to sync to the sim, or at least that's the best of my understanding, but the software features do not facilitate that at time of recording. The same, I believe, is true for the APU ready light, but I can't show you them for the moment. Now, on the front of the throttle we have two friction adjustment points, which are done by Allen key. Now, I'd recommend that you loosen these off when you open the package. They come in quite stiff, I think, just to keep it from moving during shipping. And along the base we have a number of detents. Now, I've removed one already. This is the center detent. It's your kind of middle position, and it's obviously useful if you're driving a mech or some sort of spaceship that has a reverse direction, so you can put it in the middle and have both sides. Installed here is an afterburner push-through detent, which there's a little bit of force, but you can push straight through it, or you can use the lifts on the handles to lift over. On the back we have the idle cutoff detent, which requires the lift to make it past, and will push through without lifting back into idle. Now, these have some limited customization. You can move the position of the detent, for example. However, the default position is all the way forward, and this is actually engaging before the afterburner does in DCS. This is a bit of a shame because it means you have to adjust the axes tuning in the curve editor, because sadly the software doesn't support the ability to remap the position of this virtually on the axis. So you can't get it to line up with your afterburner properly without tuning it in your individual flight sim and aircraft. So not ideal. I can't move this far enough to set it where I want it, but you just have to make do on that one, unfortunately. Of course, it's also something that could very easily be 3D printed replaced if you're prepared to design something like that. Or, like I said, MOZA needs to add the software support to do this inside MOZA Cockpit. On the rear of the throttle with the cutoff detent, again, this has virtual button presses, so when you pass backwards it will go into cutoff, and when you pass forwards it will go into idle. Now, the position is not configurable. Again, it needs to be configurable in the software. MOZA can fix this, but they haven't added it at the moment. So if you move the position of this detent further backwards, which you can, you're going to find that you hit the cutoff detent virtual button before you've actually gone into the detent, which again, it's the software, and that's the weakest point of all the MOZA hardware as so far I've experienced. The throttle handles themselves are pretty nice. Now, they've both run on an extended length arm, so they've got fairly typical amount of throw in the throttle movement, but they've also got some extra height, so this gives you a good deal of precision. Of course, unfortunately, it also gives you that leverage to tip the base over. The throttle axes themselves are sensed by 15-bit Hall effect rotary encoders. And as we move up the base onto the handles themselves, we've got our typical selection of Hornet switches, and they're all nice and ergonomic. You've got your air brake with fixed forward and momentary aft, as they should be, and then you've got your two hats, which you can access with the middle of your thumb nice and conveniently, and the top of your thumb for the radio. You've also got push functions on both of these. If we move around to the front, we have a Hall effect thumbstick, which is always greatly appreciated. This means it won't drift, it'll be very accurate. So top marks there. Then they have the antenna elevation axis, except this isn't an axis, it's actually two buttons. And then it has a push function, so you've got up, down and push. Now personally I would have liked to have seen a axis here with up and down keybinds optional, simply because it gives you greater precision in aircraft that use it, and the extra compatibility to use this on other aircraft that don't have this kind of control. And then we've got two more standard push buttons. Now, these paddles for the detents do have one minor concern. If you've got particularly big fingers, when this comes down past the afterburner detent to here, it squeezes up, and you can pinch your finger in there if your finger's extended all the way down. Now, I don't think anyone's going to be silly enough to actually hurt yourself with that, but I'm not a fan of that potential being there. But it shouldn't be an issue. I don't imagine many people will be putting their fingers there, and you'll probably learn your lesson after the first time. Nonetheless, that's another minor design critique on the unit. Now, inside each handle there is a rumble motor. This is similar to what you'd find in a gamepad. This is a fairly hefty weight being spun around to make vibrations and shaking handles. This acts in response to impacts and activities on your aircraft. Except, unfortunately, in my access to the software and the firmware before release, I've not been able to get it to work, and I can't show you it. I did get the AOA buffet, which gives a gentle rumbling effect inside here. Now, rumble motors are not very good at giving you hard knocks or sudden shock effects, but they are good for airframe buffet, turbulence, that kind of effect. So it's nice to have, but I don't particularly mind whether it was there or not. But in combination with, say, VR and then a force feedback joystick, it will definitely add a bit to your immersion. Lastly, on the throttle we have a joiner pin here to make them one single axis. I do find the left throttle lags behind the right a little bit on the axes measurement, but this hasn't really had any practical impact on gameplay or any issues. So how is it being to actually use in flight? Well, some of the most stressful things you can put a throttle through are, of course, air-to-air refueling and landing on a Case 1 recovery on the boat. And in my time with the unit, I've been very happy with the precision of it. It's worked very well. I've actually found it quite easy to find a nice balancing point on controls even during air-to-air refueling, and it's been plenty precise enough for me to make accurate corrections on my carrier landings. So top marks there for performance in-game. But like I said, if you are accessing this from above, it's down on your left side, you could easily lean into this a little bit and make it wobble. So ideally you either want to fashion something to mount it or secure it, or you want to pick up the MOZA desk mount, or I think there was a table mount as well available. But overall, I'm very happy with the unit as a whole. It's got some design flaws. I do think the price is reasonable, but the design flaws drag it down a little bit because it shouldn't really be tipping like this. And the software, that's the real kicker for me. It's fine, but it lacks features, customization that I would expect. And I trust that in future, MOZA will be able to improve that and add these features in. It's just going to be a matter of time. So overall, I'm pretty happy with the unit. It's a Valiant first throttle design, coming in at $329 US, 359 euros, or 329 British pounds. The price feels fair, high quality, but let down by a couple of design flaws. If you're interested in getting one, I strongly recommend mounting it or buying a MOZA flight support plate to keep it stable. Now, before we go, one last item to address. Those of you closely following flight sim communities may have heard about the accusations of code theft and the violation of the GPL v3 license in the MOZA cockpit software. VP Force Telem FFB is an open source force feedback solution. Under this license, code can be used to make derivative works provided it's accredited and also open source. I got in touch with MOZA directly to ask this difficult question, to address and discuss this concern. I got back a statement that sadly they would not allow me to publicly share. Understandably, they wish to keep messages to official channels. However, they did allow me to paraphrase its content. Presuming I've understood them correctly, MOZA had planned to make a forked open source build of Telem FFB to act as a translation layer sending information into the independent program MOZA Cockpit, allowing support of force feedback profiles within the greater flight sim community. They prototyped this but abandoned development due to complexity concerns. Obsolete code designed to receive this telemetry was left behind and later found by users in the public build of MOZA Cockpit. This included VP variables intended to differentiate it from their own telemetry. These references were removed last year. Second, that a telemetry FFB Lua script repository was temporarily utilized during prototyping. However, they never actually implemented it in the final product, and they were promptly removed following community feedback. They do still have some interest in developing a future SDK to provide greater cross-compatibility. MOZA state that their cockpit software is entirely self-developed, with no direct or indirect use of GPL-v3 code, and that they're committed to transparency and integrity in all their endeavours. I've encouraged MOZA to share the full statement publicly. If they do, I will link it in the description, so hopefully, with both sides of the story, that helps clarify things. I'll leave it at that and in your hands. So, I hope you've enjoyed. I plan on covering the MOZA AB9 force feedback base in the near future. Due to health issues, I've delayed it and prioritised the throttle first, reflecting its imminent release priority. Tomorrow should be the beginning of a new tutorial series, but in the meantime, let's have a listen to some of those switches. Take care.